Helene was a significant storm that left an indelible mark on the communities it struck, the political landscape in Washington, D.C., and the broader conversations surrounding disaster preparedness, climate change, and emergency response policies. As with any major natural disaster, the aftermath of Hurricane Helene ignited debates about federal and local government responsibilities, resource allocation, and how best to protect vulnerable regions from future storms. In the days following Helene's impact, the policy discussions in D.C. became as heated as the storm's winds, with politicians on both sides of the aisle grappling with the political implications of disaster relief and climate-related legislation. Hurricane Helene was a Category 4 storm, a classification that speaks to its incredible strength and the vast destruction it unleashed. With wind speeds reaching upwards of 130 miles per hour, Helene proved to be one of the more intense hurricanes to make landfall during its season. While hurricanes of this magnitude are not entirely uncommon, the ferocity with which Helene approached the southeastern United States caught many by surprise, despite the numerous warnings issued by meteorological agencies. The storm developed rapidly over the warm waters of the Atlantic, fueled by favorable atmospheric conditions that allowed it to grow in strength and intensity as it moved westward. Hurricane season in the Atlantic Basin typically spans from June 1st to November 30th, a 6-month window during which conditions are most conducive to the formation of tropical storms and hurricanes. This period coincides with the peak warming of ocean waters, which serve as the primary energy source for these storms. Helene made landfall during the peak of this season, in mid-September, when hurricane activity historically tends to be at its most active. By this point in the season, many regions along the Gulf Coast, eastern seaboard and Caribbean have already been on high alert, as storms can often develop with little warning and wreak havoc within days of forming. When Helene struck, it did so with immense power. The storm made landfall near the Carolina coast, battering cities and towns across North Carolina and South Carolina with torrential rain, dangerous storm surges, and powerful winds that toppled trees, power lines, and buildings. Flooding quickly became the primary concern as rivers swelled beyond their banks, inundating homes, businesses, and critical infrastructure. Roads were rendered impassable, cutting off entire communities from vital supplies and emergency services. Coastal towns that had weathered previous storms found themselves once again at the mercy of nature, but Helene's force was such that even those who had prepared thoroughly were caught off guard by the sheer scale of the devastation. In Washington, the immediate aftermath of Hurricane Helene led to a scramble for disaster relief funding and emergency declarations. The Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, was quickly mobilized to assist in recovery efforts, but questions arose about the adequacy of federal preparedness in the face of increasingly frequent and destructive storms. Politicians debated how best to respond, with some advocating for increased funding for climate change mitigation measures, while others focused on the more immediate concern of providing aid to affected communities. The debate was emblematic of broader political divides in the nation's capital, where discussions about the impact of climate change on the frequency and intensity of hurricanes have become a focal point of partisan conflict. For those who argue that climate change is exacerbating natural disasters, Helene provided yet another data point in a growing body of evidence that hurricanes are becoming more intense and more damaging. Warmer ocean temperatures, they contend, are fueling stronger storms, while rising sea levels make coastal communities more vulnerable to storm surges. Critics of current policies called for a renewed focus on reducing greenhouse gas emissions, investing in renewable energy sources, and implementing stricter building codes in vulnerable areas. On the other side of the debate, there were those who questioned the link between climate change and hurricane intensity, instead focusing on the need to improve disaster response mechanisms and ensure that FEMA and other agencies are adequately funded and equipped to handle future storms. The political fallout from Helene's devastation extended beyond just discussions of climate change. In the wake of the storm, there was a renewed focus on the allocation of federal disaster relief funds, with some arguing that certain regions of the country consistently receive more attention and resources than others. This criticism often falls along geographic lines, with Gulf Coast and southeastern states, where hurricanes are more common, receiving more immediate federal support than areas that are less frequently impacted by such storms. The political ramifications of this perception were evident in the debates that followed Helene. as lawmakers from affected states lobbied for additional funding and support for rebuilding efforts. While Helene was a powerful and destructive storm, it was not the strongest hurricane to ever hit the United States. That distinction belongs to the Labor Day hurricane of 1935, which remains the most intense storm ever to make landfall in the country. With sustained winds of 185 miles per hour and a central pressure of 892 millibars, the Labor Day hurricane caused widespread devastation in the Florida Keys, leaving a trail of destruction that claimed hundreds of lives. In comparison, Hurricane Helene's wind speeds and pressure, while significant, did not reach the same catastrophic levels, though its impact on the Carolinas and surrounding areas was still immense. The response to Helene highlighted the challenges that governments face in preparing for and responding to natural disasters in an era of climate change and increasingly extreme weather events. For many in Washington, the storm was a wake-up call, a reminder that hurricanes like Helene are likely to become more frequent and more powerful in the years to come. As a result, there were calls for renewed investments in infrastructure that could withstand the impact of future storms, as well as policies aimed at reducing the nation's carbon footprint and addressing the root causes of climate change. At the local level, the aftermath of Helene was marked by stories of resilience and recovery, as communities came together to rebuild in the wake of the storm. Volunteers from across the country descended on the affected areas, offering assistance with cleanup efforts, distributing supplies, and helping to restore a sense of normalcy to those whose lives had been upended by the hurricane. However, the road to recovery was long and arduous, with many residents facing months, if not years, of rebuilding. In terms of policy, Hurricane Helene sparked renewed discussions about the National Flood Insurance Program, which provides coverage to property owners in flood-prone areas. The program has long been criticized for being underfunded and for incentivizing development in areas that are highly vulnerable to flooding. In the wake of Helene, there were calls to reform the NFIP to better reflect the risks posed by increasingly intense hurricanes and to discourage construction in areas that are likely to be repeatedly impacted by storms. Another issue that arose in the aftermath of Helene was the question of whether local governments were adequately prepared to handle the storm's impact. While many areas had taken steps to prepare for the hurricane, including issuing evacuation orders and setting up emergency shelters, there were concerns that some communities had not done enough to protect their residents. This was particularly true in low-income areas where residents were less likely to have the resources to evacuate or adequately prepare their homes for the storm. In response, there were calls for increased investment in disaster preparedness programs that specifically target vulnerable populations. The devastation caused by Helene also highlighted the importance of improving infrastructure in coastal areas to protect against future storms. Many of the communities that were hardest hit by the hurricane had outdated or inadequate infrastructure, including levees, seawalls, and drainage systems that were unable to withstand the storm's impact. In the wake of the hurricane, there were calls for federal and state governments to invest in upgrading this infrastructure to better protect against future storms. As the nation reflects on the aftermath of Hurricane Helene, it is clear that the storm has left a lasting impact not only on the communities it struck, but also on the broader political and policy landscape. The debate sparked by the hurricane will likely continue for years to come, as the country grapples with how best to prepare for an uncertain future in which storms like Helene may become increasingly common and increasingly destructive. While the immediate focus will be on helping the affected communities recover, the longer-term challenge will be to implement policies that can mitigate the impact of future storms and protect the most vulnerable among us.